In this video, I'm going to show you how I made this dovetail box. I hope that it can be helpful to you if you plan to make your own project like this, or if you don't, I hope you just find it fun to watch. If you like the video, go ahead and hit the like button. If you want to subscribe, that would also be great. I posted my first video almost 1 year ago and had the goal of getting 100 subscribers in my first year. It would be awesome to hit that goal by the end of the month, but enough of that, on to the build. I'm going to start this project with my pieces of wood already milled and ready to go. As a general rule, you want to make sure your pieces are square and true and that your opposite sides are the same length as each other. The better the pieces of wood are that you start with, the easier everything else will be. Before we begin, let's talk about some terms I'm going to be using a lot throughout the video. You'll often hear me talking about pins and tails. These are the tails. In my mind, I picture a beaver tail, and that helps me to remember. And these are the pins. In my mind, I just remember that these are the other ones. If you have a good way to remember which ones are the pins, tell us in the comments. So again, these are the tails and these are the pins. The first thing you're going to do is decide which pieces you want to use for your tails and which ones you want to use for your pins. In a drawer, there is a right way to choose. You want to make sure you have your tails on the side to make the most use of the joint strength. But for a box like this, it's really just a matter of preference. I usually choose to make the tails on the longer side or on the side that will be on display. Once I've chosen which pieces will be the tails and which ones will be the pins, I'm ready to begin. The first thing that I'm going to do is mark a depth line on each piece. I measure the thickness of the pin boards and mark the measurement of that onto the tail board. I measure the thickness of the tail boards and mark the measurement of that onto the pin board. I get my measurement by resting my marking gauge on top of one piece and then dropping the cutter until it hits the bench. I lock that measurement in place and then use that cutting edge to mark the wood. The reason we're marking the pieces this way is because when we go to put the box together, the tails will be pushed into the pin board the thickness of the tail board. Or looking at it from the other way, the pin board will sit in the tail board the thickness of the pin board. This will make sense as we keep going. Sometimes the pin boards and tail boards will be different thicknesses and you'll have to take two measurements, but in my case, everything was the same thickness, so I only had to take one measurement and use that marking for all of the boards. Once I've marked my depth lines, I'm ready to start marking lines to cut the tails. I'm going to have two tails, and laying out for this is quite simple. I decided I wanted to have a 1/4 inch between my tails and a 1/4 inch on each end, so I mark a 1/4 inch in from each side. Then I find the middle point and mark 1/8 of an inch on either side to add up to a 1/4 inch in the middle. I square those lines across, and I'm ready to go. Now at this point, most people would use some sort of dovetail marker to draw the lines on the side, but I'm going to use a dovetail jig so I can skip that step. The jig I'm using is from the Katz Moses store. I'll put a link in the description. To use this jig, you start by establishing your cut straight on your line, and then once you've established the cut, you bring the side of the jig marked tails towards your saw. The magnets of the jig will hold your saw at the correct angle, and all you need to do is saw. Just make sure you don't go past your depth line, and make sure you are sawing on the correct lines. You want to end up with tails, not some other shape. So I start on the right side, skip a line, saw that next one, and then flip the piece over and repeat that process. When you've done that, you'll end up with pieces that look like this. You can see the tails, but we still have to find a way to get them out. In other words, we have to remove those little pieces of wood surrounding the tails. The outside pieces are relatively straightforward. I use a chisel to define that knife wall, and then I saw straight down that line. I use a 90-degree face of the Katz Moses jig to help keep a straight cut up and down. I saw slowly toward the end of the cut and the small piece should fall right off. Now comes the more difficult part, removing the small piece in between the tails. I think this part of the process is probably what scares most people away from doing dovetails. But if you have the right tools and you're willing to put in the effort to learn, it is manageable. Now you could use a coping saw or a fret saw to get the bulk of the waste out and then chisel the rest. That's the way most people do it. But I prefer a method I learned from Paul Sellers. With a very sharp chisel, you shave a thin layer of material toward the knife line. You have to be very careful at the beginning so you don't remove too much material or move that knife wall. Once you've shaved a bit of the material away, you bring the piece up to the bench and gently use your chisel to mark the knife wall a little bit deeper. Then it's back to the vise to shave away more material, then back to the bench to make the knife wall deeper. The more material you've removed, the more aggressive you can be. When you're working with a nice sharp chisel, I think this is one of the most satisfying ways to complete this step. Repeat this process for all the tail boards and you end up with something like this. Now it's time to start marking the tails onto the pin boards. If you haven't done so already, at this point it's really important to clearly mark which pieces go with which. I like to put the pieces together how I want the box to be and mark each corner with an A, B, C, or D. You also want to make sure that you know which side is the inside and which side is the outside. For me, this was easy to remember because one side of my board already had finish on it, and I decided to use that for the inside of my box. But for you, you want to make sure you clearly mark which side is the inside and which side is the outside. There are many ways to trace the tails onto the pin boards, but I found a method that I like using and I've been using lately. Rather than marking one at a time, I place all the pieces on a flat surface and clamp them together in the shape of the box. This allows me to mark the lines with the pieces in the position I'll eventually want them to be in when the box is assembled. I make sure everything lines up nicely and sits flat against the surface I'm working on. I take time to adjust every corner so that it lines up perfectly. Then I use a sharp pencil to mark all the tails onto the pin boards. It's really important to get your marks as accurate as possible. Now that I have the lines marked, it's time to cut the pins. The same as before, you start your cut, bring the jig to your saw, and then use it to help you guide the saw through the cut. One thing to note, if you marked your lines the same way I did, you're going to want to make sure that your cut is inside the line, in the side of the waist. There shouldn't be any gap between your saw blade and the pencil line, but the line itself should be showing after you make the cut. Remember, you had the tail directly over the part of the wood it's going to replace. The pencil line was on the outside of that, so only the wood within the pencil line needs to be removed. If you cut on the line, or if you cut on the wrong side of the line, you'll have big gaps in your dovetail and it won't fit very well. I know this because I accidentally did this on one of the joints. I'll show you later when I fit the joint together, and I'll also show you how I fixed it. Cut your pins down to the depth line, and then once you've done that, it's time to remove the material between the pins. We'll use a larger chisel in the same method as before. Once again, make sure that your chisel is nice and sharp. If it's not sharp, I'd recommend one of the other methods. Once those small pieces are removed, you want to clean up the little leftover bits with the chisel. At this point, in theory, the box is ready to come together. So it's time to start testing the fit of each joint. When you do this, one of three things will happen for each one. The first possibility is that the joint will fit together perfectly. I don't need to say much about this possibility because it doesn't happen very often. The second possibility is that the joint will fit together, but it will be quite loose. I'd like to say I did this for illustration purposes, but this was an honest mistake, and I'll show you how to fix this in just a bit. The third possibility, which is probably the most common one, is that the joint won't fit together because it's too tight. This is quite common, and when this happens, you'll want to do some detective work to figure out what material needs to be removed so that the joint will fit together properly. On this box, one joint came together for me on the first try, two of them were too tight and needed some material removed, and one joint was quite loose. So let me show you how I dealt with that one. I'll often use a mixture of sawdust and wood glue to fill small gaps in dovetails, but the gap here was too big for that method. So what I did instead was I found a piece of wood that was the same kind as the box. I cut a thin slice off of it. I used sandpaper to shade the piece down to the exact thickness I needed, and then I tested to make sure it would fit in the gap. And then I set it aside till I was ready to glue everything together. That was the next part of the process. When you glue these together, you want to spread a thin layer of wood glue in the pins and in the tails if you want. The only thing to keep in mind here is the order in which you bring everything together. You need to make sure you save one of the tail boards for last, otherwise it won't work. Otherwise it's fairly straightforward. I got the box together, I added the thin slice of wood into the gap, and then I clamped everything to make sure it was seated nicely. While the box was drying, I spent some time working on the base for the box. For this, I used what had used to be the face of a drawer. I cut it down to rough length, I planed out the finish that was once there, and then rounded over the edges. It was a lot of work to get this piece ready to serve as a base, but I wanted the wood to be a bit thinner, and I also needed to make sure I was working with bare wood so that the glue would hold. Once the box was dry, I got it out of the clamps, sawed off the piece sticking out, and started sanding all the faces. Sanding the faces reveals any small gaps that are remaining in the joints. To fill these gaps, now I use that mixture of wood and sawdust that I mentioned before. I put the glue on the back of my plastic card scraper holder. I add sawdust in small amounts, stirring it until it's at the consistency that I want. Once it is, I use a thin slice of wood like a spatula to spread the mixture into all the cracks and gaps. I wait a while for it to dry and then sand everything again, and after this, any gaps will be virtually invisible. Once the box was sanded to the degree I wanted it, I glued it to the base. To do this, I spread a thin layer of glue on the bottom edge. I placed it carefully centered where I wanted it, and once the glue had grabbed the wood, I put a lid on so that I could clamp it all together. The lid I used to clamp things down would end up being planed down and shaped for the final lid, but I'll show you more on that if I make a video of putting hinges onto this box. But for now, this is how my dovetail box turned out. I added a little bit of butcher block oil just to kind of bring out the joints a little bit more and give it a little bit of a finish. I have to say I'm pleased with how this came out. I think I'm going to use this to hold my chest pieces for my chest set, but I'm not sure about that yet. Wherever it ends up though, I think it will do nicely. Well, I hope you had a good time watching and maybe even learned something. Until next time, take care.